Good morning. On Monday, the 22nd of March, brackets, pre-record. Doing a bit of a BBC pre-record. Dawn, here we go on one of many of these brief chats that I think I hope people will find are quite important topics. And perhaps this is a biggie, isn't it? We're going to ask you to talk about PreFIT, and I'm no researcher or academic, as you know, but because I listen to a lot about what you say, this was a big deal, this study, wasn't it?
Oh,
and
waited a long time for this, yes.
And we've called it Why PreFIT Proved Unfit, that would suggest it wasn't such a great outcome, but I guess you're going to tell us we didn't get what we expected, but what we learned is important.
Absolutely, you got it in one.
And before I hand you over to kind of do your thing, I'm just looking right down at the bottom of the side, conflict of interest. You were a co-author.
I am indeed.
So it's your fault, right?
Absolutely, completely.
Go for it. Go on, tell us. What was it? What did it set out to do? Go on.
It set out to be the largest definitive study to see whether screening and falls prevention interventions would reduce fractures.
Fractures.
That was its main
the outcome.
But they looked at falls as well, because falls happen more frequently than fractures. So if you're powered for fractures, you're powered for falls.
And when you say powered, you mean the research study is powered to achieve the outcome?
Yeah, the statistics are totally clear because you've got so many people. It can't be a chance thing. So the underlying story is neither the Otago programme nor a multifactorial assessment and intervention programme reduced falls or fractures in community dwelling older people recruited through GP practices.
Come on then, let's go on.
So,
that sounds pretty grim.
Yeah. And hence people have started to say, should we just give up on fall services? They obviously don't work. But there's a big no. And I'm going to explain why. So the conflict of interest is, yes, I am a co-author. I was on a paper with Susan Finnegan about why we chose Otago rather than FAME, for example, as the exercise arm. And I'll be on the big HTA report because it was funded by the NIHR. I'll now explain why some of the many reasons why it probably didn't show an effect. And the underlying thing is, stop cherry picking the evidence, deliver with fidelity, and
that's not a new message, is it?
It's not new at all. And do you know what? It was a pragmatic study delivered through NHS services with the knowledge that they don't deliver anything properly, and with fidelity, sadly, they do cherry pick to their heart's content. And what we've really shown is that cherry picking just doesn't work. Okay,
no cherry pickers.
Yeah. So let me do a little bit of an explanation about what it is or was. Essentially, it was a screening and falls intervention study. So this was not people getting referred to falls prevention services and following them before and after. This was, can we find the fallers through GP practices? And if we can find them, can the GP practices, and in some instances fall services, but it was mostly led by the GP practice, can they introduce a falls prevention programme, either exercise or multifactorial, and can in the long run, over an 18-month period, we see a reduction in fractures. So essentially, people were over 70, recruited from GP practices, so not from falls clinics, not by physiotherapists, just any GP practice that had a list of over 70s, they were sent a big screening form. So first of all, each practice was assigned an arm. So this was a 3-arm study. I'm just going to show you one other slide first. This bit of a lot of wording here, but it was a randomised control trial. That means people randomly get put into one of 3 arms. And one arm is just get a leaflet, get an AgeUK leaflet through the post. The second arm was do Otago exercise. The third arm was a multifactorial assessment and intervention. However, it wasn't randomised by person. It was randomised by practice. So one GP practice would be randomly told you're delivering Otago, or anyone that you define as high risk will get Otago. The other GP practice, anyone that you define as high risk, you're going to do a multifactorial intervention. And the lucky GP practices who are told you can just send out an AgeUK leaflet. Yay. Okay. So the sad thing is that this study showed it was just as good to send out the AgeUK leaflet as to do everything else. That's the scary thing. But anyway, we'll come back to they were sent recruited by practice. So 9,803 screening questionnaires were sent out. That's a massive study. Massive.
The biggest study of,
yes,
of its kind for this outcome.
Now, let me just go back one stage. PROACT, that was the FAME study in GP practices. Yeah. So we know that recruiting through GP practices and randomly putting people into a FAME or Otago or no exercise trial group, we still reduce falls. So it's not the GP practice's fault. But anyway, we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
So the questionnaire itself was not the one that you might see quite often called FRAT, a nice brief 5-question one. It was one that was based on the ABS-BGS guidelines. But within that, those original set of guidelines, a physio is meant to assess someone's gait and their balance. So how a screening postal questionnaire addressed that is another matter. So it's obviously self-report on balance and gait. And only those at higher risk were offered intervention. So although there were 9,803 questionnaires sent out, only those who came back as higher risk were offered the intervention. And that's important. I'll come back to that.
And self-reported high risk.
Yes. Okay. Just to make sure you appreciate, this is just community dwelling older people. So anyone living in care homes or residential homes or who were terminally ill were excluded, but otherwise they could go in. And they were representative of the population. So they had most of them had 3 or more medical conditions, 20% to 30% had fallen in the previous year. So it's the sort of population group you would expect to get in over 70s through GP practices. So the results, neither the multifactorial group nor the Otago group showed any reduction in fractures compared to just sending them an AgeUK leaflet over an 18-month period. Ditto, neither of those two groups showed a reduction in falls compared to just giving someone a leaflet. So this is really quite scary. What we did see, the only positive result we saw, is that Otago, the exercise group, did show improved quality of life, and it came through as cost effective to deliver the intervention to improve quality of life. Not to reduce fractures or falls, but to improve quality of life. So are these results definitive? Well, yes, you could argue they are, because it's an intention to treat study. 9,000 people were put into the study. They were put into their 3 arms, but only those at high risk were offered any form of intervention. So all those that were low risk were still followed for the 18 months and still counted in the arm they were put in. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So the original study was powered to show effect if you had at least 1,872 participants in each arm. Well, each arm had over 3,000, so immediately go, wow, it's doubled, it's massive, must be important. But actually, when you look at the figures of who was high risk in the GP practices, for example, offered Otago, who was high risk and who was then offered the Otago, it was only 22% of the entire 3,000 people. So that's a fifth. So a fifth of the people in that entire arm were even offered Otago. So would we expect, unless it was a flipping miracle, that only a fifth of them doing anything might actually make a difference to the 4/5 doing nothing, but still being counted in the data? And this is because it's a screening and intervention study. It's basically, is it cost effective to do screening, like breast screening? And basically the answer is no. So we know that, okay, it's no. However, what I want us to think more about is it was such a small percentage. In the multifactorial arm, it's only 19% of the people in the 3,000 odd in that arm were actually given a multifactorial assessment and intervention. So it's not surprising that particularly multifactorial interventions, which more recently have not been as effective as those original studies, because people keep cherry picking and changing who's delivering which part of the intervention, then essentially it was going to have trouble showing an effect anyway. But the whole point was, is it worth doing a screening program for falls through GP practices? And the answer is definitely no. That doesn't mean we need to throw away fall services with the bathwater. And that's really important that we get that message. Okay, so I wanted to first of all talk about Otago, because let's face it, we think Otago's best thing since sliced bread. There's been loads and loads of studies that have shown it reduces falls. This is not the first time it hasn't, though. If you remember, PROACT didn't show Otago reduce falls either.
But
well, it's interesting that both of those studies only had Otago as a 6-month program, not the original 1 year that all the original research is based on. So if we just take dose as a simple message, they're probably not getting enough dose.
And am I right in saying that the participants in Otago were supported by buddies, by peer mentors? In PROACT, they were meant to be supported by peer mentors. We couldn't recruit enough peer mentors, and they didn't do enough home visits. So they didn't get the same support. They didn't get the same dose, and they very, very rarely progressed. And guess that's 3 critical fidelity markers, isn't it? Happened in this. Yeah. So first of all, 6-month program, and that was a pragmatic decision by the study authors, because in the NHS you're lucky if they deliver a 6 to 8 week program, let alone a 6 month, and there's no way they're going to deliver a year one. So pragmatically we thought we'd look at a 6-month program, even though there's that slight warning sign from PROACT. So within that 6 months, they were expected to get 7 contacts, so 7 visits or phone calls, 4 in person by the physios or 1 or 2 exercise instructors. This was mostly delivered by physios over that 6 months. Actually, they only got 5.5, so they had less contacts than was expected, which happened in PROACT. The other thing, that if you sort of peel out a few things, 86% improved to or remained at the upper level of strength, but the paper doesn't say how many were already at the upper level. So were they too fit? Question mark, question mark. 72% improved or remained at the upper level of balance. So again, were they too fit? But interestingly, at the beginning, only half scored the 1 or 2 on that 4-point balance scale. So that suggests they weren't really good at balance, but it does suggest they didn't progress necessarily as much as they should. Don't know. There was, in all of that data, a small, significant, but only just decrease in falls rate between 4 and 8 months, but then it just disappeared, and it wasn't there before that. So that might suggest that, and it was about 21%, which is give or take about what you'd expect to see in a sustained program. So it wasn't sustained, and certainly by 18 months there was no sign of any actual effect. So we're back again to perhaps this might have worked had it been a 1-year program, had it potentially had more participants and not so many that weren't receiving an intervention, which are still counted in that data. And of course, no, perhaps not quite enough support. And I will, in a minute, also talk a little bit about the weights and the progression. Some of these data is not actually yet out in published papers, but it will be out in the big HTA report and in future papers. But essentially, very few people, so only 40-odd% had any increase in ankle weights at all, and only 32 people out of 190 had 2 or more increases in ankle weights. So guess what? Usual thing. For some reason, people have this aversion to increasing ankle weights with people in the Otago program. No progression, no progress. Oh, but yeah, this is a pragmatic study. Let's see what happens in real life. And in real life,
cherry
That's what
picking.
happens.
Cherry picking. So on the multifactorial, I won't spend quite so long on this, but I want to just pull out a couple of points. So again, a reminder that only 19% of all the patients in that arm actually got an intervention, an assessment and intervention on multifactorial. The multifactorial team included nurses, GPs and geriatricians. No mention of OTs or physiotherapists. Now, we know the physios delivered the Otago programme, and we know that some of the multifactorial assessments meant a referral to a physio, but the physios were not an embedded part of the team, and neither were OTs. So we also, unfortunately, in the published work, don't really know how many of these assessments occurred in falls clinics with multiple roles and multiple professions delivering that, or how many were just delivered by the GP and the practice nurse. Can a GP and a practice nurse know whether somebody really needs an exercise program or not, or make a decision that person's too frail to benefit from it, or etc.? And I think that's really quite important. The other thing we also know from previous Cochrane reviews, if, for example, someone has a home hazard assessment, which is a key part of a multifactorial intervention, assessment and intervention, we know that if it's not delivered by OTs, it rarely works. We know that. We've seen the research. And so if a nurse or a GP is doing that, is it worth doing? In some instances it will be, but we're constantly trying to make it easy for everyone to do everything. And, this is a specialist assessment and intervention. Only 60% of people were offered a medication review, a key part of a multifactorial assessment and intervention. And interestingly, only 17% of those had any medication modification. And actually, the mean number of drugs went up. I hope there's no GPs watching, but this is also my experience with older people. Go in for something and give them another pill for another symptom. And yet go to a geriatrician and halve the number of pills that someone's on. So again, who should be doing medication reviews? And only 39% of that multifactorial group were offered exercise. Considering exercise is the evidence base with the most prominent evidence base in falls prevention, why only 39% offered? And then sadly, only 68% of them took it up. So there was a really fairly high refusal rate. So again, is that the way it's presented? Is that all sorts of potential what ifs there? Progression of ankle weights was even more poor in the multifactorial group than it was in the Otago. And in terms of GP evidence, documented evidence in their notes, there was only documented evidence of action in 36% of the recommended interventions. So in other words, there was a lot of assessments and many of those interventions may not have worked or have happened. So there we go.
So that's assessment without action, basically. We've assessed something but haven't acted upon the assessment outcome.
And this can happen often. You say to someone, you really could do with an eyesight test, please go along and see your optician, and the person goes home and goes, I don't want to buy a new pair of glasses, I'm not going to the optician, etc. There's also, or you've got really bad feet, do you not think you should get a podiatry appointment? And they're not easy to get anymore, and they cost in some instances. So many of these, we're back again to, unless the intervention actually happens, why it's just not worth doing. And the best, if you look at all the original research in multifactorial, the assessment was done and the intervention was done by the same people. Essentially it was done and dusted and that person couldn't escape. Not quite, but, So my final thoughts, this was a pragmatic study. Essentially, does screening work and is it worth doing through GP practices? And yes, the answer is no, it doesn't. But it does not mean we need to throw out falls clinics and falls prevention interventions with the bathwater. Because this was not a typical full service delivered intervention. It was mostly GP led. It was mostly not the correct profession delivering their part. It was other people. And we really know that if we deliver something with fidelity, with the right dose, with the right progression, with the right intervention at the right time for the right person, we know from the research it's clear that reduces falls. It may not make a difference to fracture rates in the long run, but we certainly know it reduces falls. And I think it's just so important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Otago works if it's delivered properly. Multifactorial intervention assessments and interventions work if they're delivered properly, and we stop cutting corners and being too pragmatic. Let's stop being pragmatic. We wouldn't be pragmatic with cancer treatment. We wouldn't be pragmatic with aspirin. We wouldn't be pragmatic with heart blood pressure pills, but somehow we're pragmatic with exercise to prevent falls. We need to stop doing that. We need our NHS services to deliver what they're meant to deliver. And to be honest, the biggest thing this says to me is it shouldn't be delivered through GP practices. It should be delivered through those medical professionals and allied health professionals that work with frailer older people, know about medication interactions, know about working with people. That's my final thought.
Thank you very much. So to be clear, pre-fit, unfit. But we learned from that. I guess let's just hope, as is with a lot of research, with respect, sometimes the headlines take center stage without really investigating the small print. All right, that's it for now. So we welcome ongoing discussion and questions on this one, I think, on the forum. Absolutely. So thank you very much, Dawn. See you on the next one. Bye for now.
See you later.